Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Editor-in-Chief Jeff Paulet. Thanks for being with us. Today we're joined by Rich Cohen, chief author of the Almanac of American Politics. Rich can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Almanac's first edition came out in 1972, which would make this the 30th edition or so, give or take.
Roughly 26.
We're at 26. I can do math. It is a resource filled with valuable information, including profiles of all 535 members of Congress, all 50 governors, and more elected officials, plus analysis of voter turnout and redistricting, and an in-depth look at the 2022 midterms, campaign finance data, and more. I'm a proud owner of my almanacs. They sit very nicely in my bookshelf, and I'm happy to say that Ballotpedia helped contribute to the production of the almanacs in prior years. So, Rich, thanks for coming on the show. It is great to see you.
My pleasure, and good to be with you again, Jeff. I've enjoyed our relationship in the past and our continuing contacts.
Yeah, we first got to know each other almost a decade ago. First talking about the Almanac and how Ballotpedia could help, which we did in the 2016 and 2018 editions. But some of my favorite conversations we had were about redistricting. And we're right in the middle of what I like to call the mid-decade redistrictings, which occur because it doesn't just happen right after the census and then it's done for 10 years, because there are always maps thrown out and new maps made. But you've been on the redistricting bandwagon for quite a long time. You have some amazing stories from when you used to cover it. Can you tell our listeners about what was life like covering redistricting in the 1970s and 80s when no one else really seemed to care?
Thank you for asking that. And I'm glad to talk about redistricting and all sorts of political weirdnesses. When I was a reporter covering Congress at a magazine called National Journal, which sadly passed on, but I was a reporter there for the better part of, for more than 30 years. And every 10 years showed interest and wrote about redistricting in the various states. And frankly, back in the 1980s and 1990s, my colleagues, my editors at National Journal thought that my interest in redistricting was peculiar, to say the least. There's a lot more interest now by the public, by the political community, greater interest now than there was 30, 40 years ago. But it was important then, and obviously remains important. What struck me way back in those days is that there were some real political insiders who mastered redistricting. Probably the best known, most effective was a congressman from California named Phil Burton, who had the seat now held by Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. Phil Burton, in the state of California, with 50 plus districts, had the fate of Republican and Democratic members of the House from California completely in his hand. He controlled how the maps were drawn, what were the political consequences, and he was not only skillful, he was ruthless. I enjoyed writing about him then, and back in those years, back in those days, there was Phil Burton and other redistricting experts didn't have the kind of computer resources that we have available now, so a lot of the redistricting information was in his head. Impressive in its own way to know, how to affect political outcomes up and down the state of California. And he just did it by mastering the data.
It's gotten a lot more sophisticated. I mean, the term gerrymandering has been around since the early 1800s. So it's gone on forever. It's just that in the last decade or so, it's gotten a lot more attention because the sophistication through these computers has really changed things. Were they using computers much in the 80s and 90s from what you recall covering it? Or did it really only just start with the 2000s?
No. By the 1990s, there was extensive use of computers, obviously not quite as sophisticated as now. But I think my sense is that redistricting really came into its own, became a significant factor beyond what I described earlier with Phil Burton in California. It became a significant political factor in the 1992 cycle because, as has been written by various folks, that's when Republicans nationwide decided to work with African Americans in various states, especially in the South, to increase, or in many cases, create African American districts in states that had not had them. And that was good for African Americans, but it tended to be bad for white Democrats. and for Democrats generally, and therefore it was good for Republicans. And we're still, frankly, we're seeing the results, ramifications of those racial changes. That too has become more sophisticated. We can talk more about this if you'd like. But even today, we're doing this on Wednesday, September 6th. There was a federal court ruling in Alabama trying to figure out whether the state should have a second Black majority district, and the federal court said yes. Ballotpedia, as we talked about a moment ago, has already kind of written about that for its readers. So this is a new degree of sophistication.
Sure. We could talk redistricting all day, but let's move on to the topic at hand, which is the Almanac. So if you cover and follow American politics, then you know what the Almanac is. But many of our listeners, Rich, probably don't know. So for those of them who don't, what is the Almanac for American Politics, and why is it such an important resource that you and your team set out to create each cycle?
This is the hefty 2,100-page edition, which we just published a couple weeks ago. It, as you said earlier, Jeff, it's been published every 2 years since 1972. It was started and a stroke of brilliance by a guy named Michael Barone, who is fortunately still with us. And so he was chief author of the Almanac after having created it in 1972. He remained chief author for the next 44 years, which to me is kind of an awesome accomplishment. And he has all that data, lots of data in his head. And he decided briefly with some former college classmates, that there was a need for something called the Almanac at the time in the early 1970s, because the protesters of the Vietnam War, who, as they were lobbying Congress and their local members of Congress and the Senate and the House, there really wasn't much of a resource. It was hard to get information about who those people, those members of Congress were. So Michael's concept was to create, and he did, a book that profiles all the members of Congress. And it's expanded some over the years from what Michael created, but the basic concept is his stroke of genius. And frankly, I'm in awe of Michael for what he did and how he kept the Almanac going.
Yeah, every cycle it's proven to be a really invaluable resource for people who are trying to understand the various elected officials. What does your role look like as chief author? What does that mean?
I'd been part of the Almanac as a writer. I was co-author with Michael Barone in the aughts for several editions. And then I became chief author of the book with the 2016 edition. So now that we've just published the 2024, I've been chief author for 5 editions. The book has gained a new publisher for the 2016 edition, Columbia Books, which is based in Arlington, Virginia. And my job is to, in working with my partners at Columbia Books, I'm in charge of the editorial team, which produces, as I said, this 2,100-page doorstop, however you want to refer to it. And I write a large share of the House profiles. We have 3 senior authors, Lou Jacobson, Lou Peck, Jessica Taylor, who write most of the profiles of 100 senators, 50 governors, and the states they represent. So I work with those senior authors, and we have several, what I refer to as our junior writers. They're junior only in age. They're very knowledgeable and well-informed. They tend to be reporters who write about Congress and about politics. They're based here in the Washington, D.C. area. So I manage the editorial team, and I work with our various vendors of data about Congress, redistricting, and about the districts, and data about the individual members. So it's there's a lot of stuff, a lot of information coming in, and we manage it. To produce a book every 2 years, and I guess and one other. An important part of the Almanac team is we have a group of researchers who help to inform the writers by presenting, preparing, compiling news clips and other sources of information, so that we, the writers, are informed of what we are writing. So we have about a half dozen researchers, and they produce a file, a set of electronic clips, source of information that is very well organized and is essential to what we do.
Yeah, Ballotpedia staff had the really wonderful experience of getting to participate and contribute to that a few years ago. So we can attest to the really valuable experience there for them. And listeners who are interested in getting their own copy of the Almanac can check out the link in the show notes. If you're going to purchase a copy, you can use the discount code that Rich has been kind enough to provide to us today, ALM24 Ballot, which you can get in the show notes. And I'll mention that again at the end as well. So I'm curious, Rich, so how has the process for the Almanac changed over the years? What's been different about how the Almanac is produced now, say, versus what it was like in, say, the 80s and 90s?
Good question. Way back in the day, Michael Barone, as kind of the chief author, and he did a large amount of the writing in the early years, and he too relied on news clips so that he was informed about what he was writing. But a major way in which the Almanac has changed and our work has changed is because of the computers that we talked about earlier. So when Michael started the book, he would order newspapers and pick up newspapers in Harvard Square, where he had been a student, and he was still living in Cambridge, as I recall. And he and a team of researchers would clip the newspapers and put those paper clips in manila folders in file cabinets. And then they would go, Michael and other writers would go to those manila folders and look at those paper clips and prepare the files, write the profiles. Now we don't, everything's digitized. We don't have manila folders, and we don't really work with, even though the desk where I'm sitting has a lot of paper around it. Most of my work and the information that I use is digitized. Is electronic. And I guess I'd make one other point. What I've described, the digitization of our work is largely positive. The more complicated factor, and it has some downsides, but we work with it, is that in getting information about the members of Congress and their states and district, we have to rely on other sources, because it's a big country. There's 535 districts and members of Congress. We're not going to know who they are. So over the decades, the 50 years since the Almanac started, we've relied heavily on news sources, newspapers, magazines, etc. The downside, as you know, Jeff, and your readers and our listeners here know, is that quality and the amount of newspapers in our daily lives has decreased. So that there's less information available through newspapers about members of Congress. So we have to we have to go elsewhere for information about members of Congress, whether we will rely on the websites of the members of Congress themselves, which can be useful to an extent. Obviously, they're not always impartial. So we take the congressional websites as a resource, and then another change since the 1970s, when the Almanac started, is that there are more websites. There were no websites about politics in the 1970s. Obviously, now there's a lot of websites. Ballotpedia is one of them, but there's a lot more. And these other websites, whether it's Washington-based news operations such as Roll Call or Politico or The Hill, we rely heavily on those resources. We also, and I mentioned, obviously, we rely on Ballotpedia. We also rely on political websites that exist in many states around the country. And again, with the help of our researchers, they provide information about local members of Congress that come from these often state-based websites that are quite good.
Yeah, the information flow from state capitals and from state political journalists. We were talking about that in 2014 and again in 16. And I think each cycle that we've met and got to know each other, we talk about the sort of the demise of political journalism and the reduction in the sort of labor force there. And each time we think we're kind of hitting the bottom, I don't think we've reached that yet, unfortunately. So I can imagine that is certainly a challenge for the researchers. How does the online presence of readership, how does the online presence of, sort of competition and political websites, how does that manifest with, what is typically has been a voluminous paper book that people want to have on their desk, like I have and like other journalists have? What does that look like for you in the online age? How has the Almanac moved into the online space over the years?
Well, most of our readers access the Almanac through the print editions, they're hardcover or softback. But we do also sell the Almanac in digital version for a lower price, and that's available through our website, which the Almanac, www.thealmanacofamericanpolitics.com. But frankly, my experience is that even with all the great digital work that you and Ballotpedia and other political websites perform, the political community, in my experience, remains strikingly dependent on paper, on print edition. So, and there are lots of Almanac readers who will have their editions of the Almanac on their desk, as I do, as you do. So we keep back editions in print readily accessible. But ultimately, as you suggested, Jeff, all of us in the political world, I think, are moving in your direction of being more digitized.
What are you most excited about for this next edition?
Well, I'm excited that we completed it, number one. And number two, that it's a challenge every 10 years to rewrite and we did, the profiles of all 435 House districts. One caveat, there's 6 states that only have one district, so we don't write. It's actually 429.
Those are the easy ones.
So what excites me and what was a challenge was first to understand, to await information from the states about how the district lines changed. And it varies, obviously, from one state to another, the extent of change. In some states, my home state of Massachusetts, the lines changed barely at all. In your state, Jeff, of South Carolina, the district where you live of Charleston changed quite a bit to give some additional protection to the local Republican member of the House, Nancy Mace. The challenge that we faced in rewriting all the districts was first to understand how the districts have changed and then to describe that for our readers. And then we always want to make the book seem relevant, timely to our readers. So that I was just in preparing for our discussion, I looked to our profile of the district where you're sitting right now in Charleston. And just as it happens, and as you know, Jeff, there's a new museum, an African-American museum in Charleston that opened in the past year.
Downtown.
So that's something we describe in the Almanac. Or in my home state of Massachusetts, we described how the Harvard University campus has expanded, or Logan Airport outside of Boston has grown. We want to make all parts of America, the 435 districts, the 100 states, we want to make these places seem timely, seem relevant to, as relevant as we can to daily life, not only in politics, but to try to understand what's going on in America.
Yeah, those profiles really are an amazing snapshot in time as well. I mean, if you go back and look at old Almanac editions, which you're able to do because you have all of them, it's pretty incredible and remarkable to read about what, a certain district was like, whether it's in the, 1982 or in 1996. It's kind of like, I've got this great set of encyclopedias on my bookshelf from 1903, and they were my grandmother's, and it's incredible to read about what were people publishing in encyclopedia back then. So I'm sure you could really, tell a great story about America through the series of almanacs over time. What do you see with the future of the almanac? How do you see it unfolding as we kind of enter this next presidential cycle and then the years after that? Where is it heading?
Well, we want to remain relevant. We want to keep our readers informed. I mean, one of in thinking about the future of the almanac, and again, this yourself through your work at Ballotpedia, that so much of America's political life has become so polarized. There are so few resources that attempt to be nonpartisan, if I could put it in those terms. The Almanac, you do it at Ballotpedia, and you're very skillfully. It's a challenge for us, and we take it very seriously at the Almanac, that we remain nonpartisan and that we want every profile, every word of the Almanac needs to be, and it's an important objective. Everything needs to be seen as fair, balanced, to use the term, by all of our readers, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, whether in the North or the South. We want it, if I can get specific, we want a profile of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the conservative congresswoman from outside of Atlanta. We want her profile to be read and viewed as fair by people on the left and right, just as we want a profile of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York City. We want her profile to be balanced and informative to our readers. So that's, if there's any challenge, it's maybe the biggest challenge we face is how to stay balanced, even-handed, nonpartisan in a world that is becoming anything but even-handed.
Yeah, it's a very very similar situation to what we experience here at Ballotpedia when we think about our readers as well. So it's perhaps one of the reasons why we've kind of shared a kindred viewpoint on writing about it and covering our political system and helping inform readers, whether it's the journalist trying to cover the election or the voter who's reading the work produced by the journalist. So
my experience is that the members of Congress, the political figures, whether they're on the left or the right, they ultimately they want to have resources that can be read by people, by the political community, broadly defined. So they, whether on the right or the left, the political right or left, or in between, they appreciate what we do because it's important that everyone, that this broad political community, our broad nation, understands who these people are and what they do and what their interests are. A Marjorie Taylor Greene or an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not even with their different partisan backgrounds, each of them and the other members of Congress, the 435 members of the House, they deal with each other. They need to understand and who these other members of the House of Representatives and of the Senate, who they are. And we are a resource, we believe, or we're pretty confident, that helps the political community, the members of Congress, their staff, the lobbyists, state and local people. We help the broad political community to understand what drives and who these people are, who drive American politics.
Yeah, there's something about putting, we like to say, warmth in a profile of an individual and humanization of political figures from across the board.
That requires continuing. I view my work as a journalist, as chief author of the Almanac, as a kind of, for myself, a continuing education in American politics. It really changes every day, every week. And it does. We need to keep ourselves fresh.
Well, Rich, it's great to see you. It's been a long time, but thanks for coming on the show today. Thanks for your expertise. It's fun talking about the Almanac, and I look forward to flipping through it and reading it on the internet as well. So thanks for coming on, and have a great rest of your odd year as we move into the even year election cycle.
My pleasure, and good luck to you and your colleagues at Ballotpedia.
And for our listeners, you can order this year's edition of the Almanac at the link in our bio. And don't forget to use our discount code ALM24Ballot for 15% off. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Ballet, and thanks for listening.